Ladies and gentlemen, tonight I invite you to step back in time, not into the glory of knights in shining armor or kings on golden thrones, but into the daily reality of the half of the population whose voices were rarely heard, whose stories were often erased, and whose existence was defined by the weight of expectation, the strict rules of faith, and the unyielding grip of tradition. Tonight, we talk about what it was like to be a woman in the Middle Ages, and I promise you it is not the fairy tale you might imagine when you see illuminated manuscripts, or when you hear the romanticized stories of chivalry, or when you picture a princess waiting in a tower for her rescue. Instead, it was a life marked by hardship, survival, duty, and sometimes quiet strength hidden beneath layers of invisibility. Imagine yourself born into a medieval village. The very moment you enter the world, your worth is already measured against expectations. If you were a boy, there would be celebration, a sense of pride, a sigh of relief. But as a girl, your arrival would be welcomed with far less enthusiasm. You were not a bearer of the family name, not a future soldier, not the heir who could inherit land or wealth. Instead, you were destined to be someone else's wife, someone else's mother, someone else's servant, and from the very beginning, your life belonged less to you and more to the people around you. Education for women was not only rare, it was actively discouraged. The idea that women should read, learn, or write was often seen as unnecessary or even dangerous. Most peasant women lived their lives never seeing a single written word, never being able to sign their names, their identities reduced to physical labor and domestic duty. In noble households, girls of higher status might learn some reading or needlework, perhaps music or manners, but always within the frame of making them more marriageable, never for their independence or intellectual fulfillment. Knowledge was not seen as their right, but as a potential threat to the order that kept them silent and obedient. Work was relentless. A peasant woman in the Middle Ages was expected to rise with the sun and tend to countless duties, caring for children, fetching water from wells or rivers, preparing meals without the luxury of stoves or ovens, baking bread in communal ovens, spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth, and tending animals. She often worked side by side with her husband in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, yet her labor was rarely acknowledged as equal. If a man plowed the fields, it was recorded as work. If a woman milked cows, collected eggs, churned butter, or brewed ale, it was considered part of her duty, not valued labor. And yet, without her, the household economy would collapse. Marriage was rarely a matter of choice. Girls could be betrothed as young as 12, sometimes even younger, their futures sealed by agreements between families or by the demands of survival. Love was seldom part of the equation. Marriage was a transaction, an arrangement to secure alliances, property, or stability. A woman was expected to obey her husband in all matters. The church and law both placed her beneath him in authority, her voice silenced, her will secondary. To disobey was not just an act of rebellion against her spouse, but against God, for the teachings of the church preached obedience as a woman's sacred duty. Childbirth defined much of a woman's existence, but it was also her greatest danger. The medieval world did not know modern medicine, and giving birth was fraught with risk. Women faced infection, blood loss, or death with every pregnancy, and with limited knowledge of hygiene or midwifery, survival was never guaranteed. For many, it was not uncommon to bury children in infancy, victims of disease, malnutrition, or poor sanitation. To be a mother was both an honor and a curse, and yet it was considered the highest purpose a woman could achieve. The church played a massive role in shaping perceptions of women. On one hand, women were associated with Eve, seen as the bringers of sin, temptation, and weakness. On the other hand, they were also associated with the Virgin Mary, revered for purity, obedience, and humility. Women were trapped between these two extremes, either dangerously sinful or impossibly pure. There was little room for individuality, for complexity, or for freedom. Women who stepped outside these roles risked being labeled witches, heretics, or worse. Superstition and fear of female power made independence dangerous. A woman who spoke too boldly, who healed with herbs, who lived without a man, or who dared to question authority could be accused of witchcraft, with devastating consequences. For noble women, life might appear more glamorous on the surface, with castles, gowns, and servants, but the truth was not so different. Their marriages were arranged for political or economic advantage. They were expected to produce heirs, to manage households, to embroider, to represent their families with grace, and sometimes to endure long absences while their husbands fought in wars. In rare cases, noblewomen managed estates in their husbands' absence, making decisions about finances, agriculture, and defense. Yet even then, their authority was temporary, always handed back once a man returned. Their identities were tied to men. First their fathers, then their husbands, and if widowed, often their sons. There were exceptions, of course, and it is worth noting them. Some women carved out lives of influence through religion, joining convents where they could become abbesses, writers, or scholars. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen remind us that some women defied the silence, leaving behind music, visions, and writings that still speak to us today. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine demonstrated political power and cunning, ruling lands, leading armies, and shaping history itself. Yet these were rare and extraordinary figures, remembered precisely because they stood out in a world where most women remained invisible. Clothing was another marker of status and gender roles. Women's dress in the Middle Ages was dictated by modesty and practicality. For peasant women, clothing was rough and simple, often made of wool or linen, designed to withstand hard labor. For noble women, fabrics were finer, silks, velvets, and furs, but still carried layers of symbolism, often restricting movement, reminding women that their role was to be admired, not active. Even their clothing reinforced the expectation of obedience and passivity. Freedom for women was limited, almost non-existent by modern standards. They could not vote, could not own property in most cases, could not pursue professions, and could not move about the world without a male guardian. Their lives were bound by the home, the church, and the expectations of society. And yet, despite this, they endured. Despite invisibility in official records, despite the silence in chronicles written almost exclusively by men, women's labor, resilience, and sacrifices built the very foundations of medieval society. Without their work in homes, fields, markets, and monasteries, the entire world of the Middle Ages would have collapsed. Think for a moment of the women whose names we will never know, whose stories were never written, who lived their lives in shadows. The woman who rose before dawn to light a fire, to feed her children, to nurse a baby in the cold of winter. The woman who walked miles to fetch water, who mended clothes until her fingers bled, who buried child after child yet still carried on. The woman who was beaten into silence, who was denied education, who prayed for salvation in a world that never saw her as equal. These were the women who made up the vast majority of the medieval population, and yet they remained faceless, voiceless in the pages of history. Even leisure for women was scarce. While men hunted, jousted, or feasted, women were often still working, mending, cooking, preparing. Festivals and holy days might provide moments of respite, but even then, their behavior was closely watched, controlled by the church, judged by the community. There was no true escape, no chance at individuality. To be a woman was to live under constant surveillance of morality, of propriety, of obedience. And yet, within these constraints, women found ways to survive, sometimes even to thrive. They built communities among themselves, sharing knowledge, supporting one another in childbirth, creating songs and traditions that passed from mother to daughter. They brewed ale not only for households but for sale in markets, becoming some of the earliest entrepreneurs. They told stories, wove tapestries, and left behind subtle legacies in the fabric of culture. Their strength was quiet, but it was real. So when we imagine the Middle Ages, we must resist the temptation to see only knights, kings, and battles. We must also remember the countless women who lived in silence, whose lives were measured in labor, sacrifice, and endurance. Their history may be boring to some because it lacks the drama of war and conquest, but in truth, it is the very heartbeat of the medieval world. To understand what it was like to be a woman in the Middle Ages is to confront the reality of invisibility, the weight of duty, and the persistence of resilience. And so, in conclusion, being a woman in the Middle Ages was a life shaped not by freedom, but by restriction, not by choice, but by duty, not by voice, but by silence. It was a life lived in shadows, yet it carried within it the strength of survival, the quiet endurance that allowed societies to function. History may not have recorded their names, but their labor, their sacrifices, and their existence echo through time. They remind us that history is not only made by kings and warriors, but also by the women who kept the fires burning, who raised the next generation, and who endured a world that rarely recognized their worth.